Robert Redford had always lived like the mountains he loved, calm on the outside, but full of storms within. He had built a career on silence, mystery, and quiet dignity. But as the years began to slip away, the once golden heart of Hollywood found himself reflecting on faces he never wanted to see again. The world saw him as the perfect gentleman, but behind that composed smile, there were wounds that fame never healed. There were 5 people he could never forgive, not out of anger, but because of what they took from him, his trust, his dreams, and the pure love he once carried for the art that shaped his life. These weren't just names from his past, they were shadows that never left him, even when the lights went out. The first was Marlon Brando, a man Redford had once admired beyond words. In his early days, Redford looked up to Brando as a trailblazer, someone who had changed acting forever. But when Redford entered Hollywood's inner circle, Brando treated him with open disdain. He mocked his good looks, called him too clean for real art, and dismissed his passion as vanity. Redford never forgot the sting of those words. To Brando, Redford was a product of the system he had grown to hate. But to Redford, Brando was a reminder that even idols could turn cruel when threatened. He never said it publicly, but in his heart, he decided that Brando would never have a place in his final piece. The man he once admired had become the first name on his silent list. The second name came from a place much closer to his heart, Natalie Wood. Redford and Natalie shared something rare in Hollywood, a real friendship. They worked together, laughed together, and trusted each other in a business where trust was a luxury. But fame has a way of turning warmth into fire. When Redford backed out of a film that Natalie desperately wanted him for, she took it personally. Their friendship fell apart quietly, one missed call at a time. When Natalie died so suddenly, Redford was shattered. He spoke little of it, but those who knew him said he carried deep guilt. Yet guilt often hides behind pride, and Redford couldn't bring himself to face what had broken between them. He loved her, respected her, but he never forgave himself, or her, for walking away before they could make things right. Her name, too, stayed on that list, not in anger, but in mourning. The third person was Sidney Pollack, the man who directed him in some of his greatest films. They were creative soulmates once, Jeremiah Johnson, The Way We Were, Out of Africa. Their collaboration shaped Hollywood in the 1970s and beyond. But over time, fame and power pulled them apart. Pollack wanted control, Redford wanted freedom. Their artistic clash turned bitter. Redford once said that Pollack stopped seeing him as a friend and only as an actor to manage. When Pollack died in 2008, Redford didn't attend the funeral. Some thought it was cold, others understood. Their bond had died long before the man did. Redford couldn't bear to stand in that room full of people pretending to mourn a friendship that had already turned to dust. He respected Pollack's talent, but he could never forgive the betrayal of trust that came when Pollack tried to shape him into something he wasn't. The fourth was a shock to those close to him, Barbra Streisand. On screen, they were magic together in The Way We Were. But behind the camera, their chemistry was both powerful and poisonous. Streisand was strong-willed, brilliant, and relentless. Redford admired her, but he also resented her ability to dominate every room. During filming, she would challenge him constantly, arguing over lines, direction, even camera angles. Years later, Streisand admitted that Redford's quietness frustrated her. She called it emotionally unavailable. Those words cut deep. Redford was never one for confrontation, he felt everything deeply but revealed almost nothing. To be called distant by someone who never tried to understand his silence left a scar. He once told a close friend, "Some people mistake stillness for emptiness." He never wished her harm, but he made peace with the fact that her voice, her control, her endless need to lead, would never be welcome when he finally rested. The fifth and final name was the hardest, his own son, James Redford. No one outside his family knew how complicated their bond really was. James was talented, kind, and full of purpose, just like his father. But growing up as Robert Redford's son was a burden, not a blessing. Robert's fame cast a shadow so large that James struggled to find his own light. Their love was real, but it was layered with misunderstanding. When James became a filmmaker and activist, Robert tried to guide him, but guidance turned into control, and advice into distance. The father who was adored by the world couldn't find the right words for his own child. When James died in 2020, Redford was heartbroken. But in his pain, he realized something cruel: the relationship had been strained for too long to heal. In a private conversation, he once said, "There are people you love, but you can't face them again, not even in death." That was the heart of his list: 5 souls who shaped his life but left him scarred. Brando for his cruelty, Natalie for the silence that killed their friendship, Pollock for betrayal, Streisand for misunderstanding him, and James for the love that never found peace. Each name carried a story that could never be rewritten. To Redford, his funeral wasn't meant to be a Hollywood event. It wasn't a place for cameras, speeches, or people who once made him feel small in a world that adored him. He wanted it quiet: no applause, no fake tears, no red carpet. Just peace. As he grew older, he began to speak less and retreat more. The man who once embodied American heroism became a ghost in his own legend. He painted, he walked alone, and he avoided the spotlight he had once owned. His friends noticed the change, but few knew it came from years of watching people twist his kindness into opportunity. Hollywood had taken so much from him: his privacy, his simplicity, his sense of self. But he had also taken something back: the right to choose who would not stand over him when he was gone. For Redford, forgiveness was not about letting go of pain, it was about keeping peace sacred. He wasn't bitter, not anymore. He had lived too long, seen too much, to hold on to hate. But his silence held power. Each name he left out of his final wish was a small act of truth, a man choosing honesty over appearances. And that honesty, more than anything else, defined Robert Redford until the end. As he sat alone in the quiet of his Utah ranch, the same place he had built decades ago, Redford reflected not on fame or fortune, but on faces. He remembered laughter, betrayal, warmth, and loss, all tangled in the story of his life. He once said, "The hardest thing isn't fame, it's staying human inside it." By the time he was ready to let go, he had made peace with the past, but not with everyone in it. And maybe that was his final message: even the kindest souls carry a few ghosts they can't invite home. In his final years, Robert Redford lived a life stripped of noise. The fame that once surrounded him had turned into a faint echo, fading into the mountains and quiet skies of Utah. He spent his mornings in stillness, painting in soft light, letting colors say the words he no longer wanted to speak. The world still remembered him as the Golden Man of Hollywood, but Redford no longer recognized that version of himself. He had built a legacy, yes, but legacies are heavy things. They follow you when you no longer wish to be followed. Redford's heart was tired of pretending. For decades, he had smiled for cameras, endured interviews, and answered questions that never touched the truth of who he was. When he finally began to withdraw, people called it isolation. But to him, it was freedom. He often thought about the 5 names he had chosen to leave behind. They weren't just people, they were mirrors of his past. Every one of them had shown him something about himself that he had once refused to see. In his solitude, Redford began to understand that he had not truly escaped them. They lived in his regrets, in his quiet guilt, in the long pauses between his thoughts. Sometimes, he would look at the old photographs scattered across his desk. His face in those pictures seemed both familiar and distant. There was the charm, the confidence, the control. But behind those eyes was a man who had been carrying more than anyone knew. Fame made him a symbol of perfection, but perfection is a kind of prison. He never talked much about his health, but he knew his time was slipping away. There were days when even the smallest breath felt heavier than before. Yet he wasn't afraid of death. He had seen enough of it to know it wasn't an ending, only a change. What frightened him was the thought of leaving this world misunderstood. People believed Robert Redford had lived a charmed life: money, beauty, success, and respect. But he carried pain like a shadow. He had lost a child in infancy, another to illness. His marriages had cracked under the pressure of fame. His friendships had turned into rivalries. And though the world adored him, he had often felt unseen. When he thought about Brando, the sting of those early days still lingered. Brando had been everything Redford once wanted to become: raw, fearless, larger than life. Yet their encounter had left him wounded. In his final years, Redford realized it wasn't Brando's cruelty that hurt him most. It was his own need for approval. He had wanted Brando to see him as an equal. When that didn't happen, he carried that wound for a lifetime. Now, with the wisdom of age, he finally forgave him. But forgiveness didn't mean invitation. He wanted peace, not presents. Natalie Wood's memory was softer. Redford would sometimes whisper her name under his breath, as if saying it too loudly might break the air. She had been light in a world full of pretenders. Her laughter, her spark, they haunted him. Her death was one of the few times he cried in front of others. In those tears was more than sadness, there was guilt. He wished he had called her back, fixed what fame had broken. But some words die unspoken. Even as he made peace with her memory, he couldn't bear the thought of her ghost lingering at his final goodbye. Sidney Pollack's face came to him often, especially when he thought about the films that made his name immortal. There was love between them once, a creative bond as deep as any friendship. But success is a jealous friend. It doesn't share space easily. Redford often wondered if they could have found their way back to understanding each other had pride not stood between them. Still, time had made him tender. He no longer held anger, only sadness that two men who had once trusted each other had become strangers. Barbra Streisand was different. She represented a chapter in his life where power and vulnerability collided. He admired her talent, her intelligence, her courage to stand firm in a world that tried to silence women. Yet he also remembered the exhaustion, the constant clash of wills, the misunderstanding that never healed. In his quiet moments, Redford admitted that she had been right about one thing: he was emotionally guarded. It wasn't pride, it was fear. He had been raised to believe that showing too much feeling was weakness. And so, he had hidden his heart even from those who cared most. But it was his son, James, who weighed on him the most. There are wounds only a father knows. Robert had tried to be the father he never had, steady, protective, strong. But in doing so, he had forgotten that love needs softness, not perfection. James had wanted closeness, not control. Redford realized this too late. When James died, the silence that followed was unbearable. He had been through loss before, but this was different. This was the kind of pain that turns into reflection. He would often walk along the ridges near his home, talking softly to the wind. He told himself James could hear him. "I'm sorry," he would whisper. "I loved you the best way I knew how." Those words were the only prayer he ever truly believed in. In those final years, Redford stopped running from himself. He began to look honestly at the man behind the myth. He had achieved everything he once dreamed of, yet peace had always been a stranger. Only when he turned away from Hollywood did he begin to understand what truly mattered. Not applause. Not legacy. But stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when you finally stop pretending to be more than human. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to respect nature, to find joy in quiet things. They would ask him about movies, about the people he had worked with, and he would smile. Stories, he would say, are just mirrors. You only see what you carry inside. That was how he taught them about life, gently, through reflection. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, when the memories would flood in like an old film reel playing without pause. Faces, voices, laughter, all blurred by time. He would sit by the window, the moonlight falling across his desk, and he would write small notes to no one in particular. Sometimes it was an apology. Sometimes it was gratitude. Sometimes it was both. He wrote one note that said, "If peace means forgetting, I'd rather remember." Another read, "Not everyone belongs in your goodbye, and that's okay." These were not bitter words. They were the truth of a man who had lived enough to understand that closure doesn't come from others, it comes from acceptance. As his body weakened, his spirit became lighter. He began to smile more, not for cameras, but for himself. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried weight. One of his close friends once asked if he regretted the list, the 5 names he wanted left out. Redford thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said softly. "It's not about hate. It's about peace. Some people just belong to your story, not your ending." In those last seasons, he found himself forgiving more easily, not because he had forgotten the pain, but because he had learned to see it differently. He understood now that everyone, even those who hurt him, had their own struggles. Brando fought demons no one could see. Natalie was fragile in a world that demanded perfection. Pollock was driven by fear of failure. Streisand was misunderstood for her strength. James was searching for freedom. Knowing that didn't erase the hurt, but it brought compassion. He once said to a friend, "Life gives you beauty and loss in the same breath. The trick is to thank both." That became his quiet philosophy. The older he grew, the less he needed to prove, the less he needed to explain. His art had already spoken for him. Now he wanted only silence, a silence that felt like truth. In those moments alone, Redford often thought about what his funeral would really mean. He didn't want crowds or speeches. He wanted his ashes scattered where the sun met the snow, no names, no flowers, no tears. "Let the world remember the films," he told a close friend. "Let those who loved me remember the man." By the time his body began to fade, his heart had already made peace. The list was never about rejection. It was about drawing a line between performance and reality. The 5 people he chose not to include were the boundaries of his truth. They marked the pain he had finally accepted but no longer needed near him. There is a strange grace that comes with age, the grace to let go. Redford had spent his youth chasing meaning and his adulthood protecting it. In the end, he discovered that meaning was never something to chase. It was always there, in the quiet spaces he used to overlook. In his final reflections, Redford was neither proud nor ashamed. He was simply honest. He had loved, lost, and learned. He had been a husband, a father, a friend, and sometimes a stranger to all 3. He had seen fame rise and fade, love blossom and break, and dreams turn into burdens. Yet through it all, he had kept his heart intact, bruised, yes, but still beating for the simple beauty of being alive. When he spoke to a close confidant near the end, he said, "I don't want a grand farewell. I've already said everything I needed to in silence." That was Robert Redford, a man of few words, but endless depth. And maybe that was his final message to the world, that peace isn't found in forgiveness from others, but in forgiving yourself for being human. He had carried the weight of silence all his life. In the end, that silence became his freedom. When he was finally gone, the world mourned a legend. But in that quiet mountain air where his spirit belonged, Robert Redford rested not as an icon, but as a man who had finally made peace with his past, and with the 5 names he chose to leave behind.